Sitting on the terrace of my Napa Valley estate, swirling a glass of my own vintage Cabernet, I often find my mind drifting back to the chaos of a few months ago. The absolute silence rolling across the vineyards is like music to my ears. It is hard to believe how far I have come from the toxic noise that once consumed my home. It was the season I finally stopped being a free servant in my own house and taught my entitled children a brutal lesson in reality. It all started about 6 months ago, when my son, Oliver, and his wife, Sophie, asked to move into the estate. Since my husband passed away, I have been managing our sprawling Napa Valley vineyard entirely on my own. I am a retired executive chef, and this property was our lifelong dream, built from the ground up with our own hands. Oliver sat me down one afternoon and gave me a very convincing pitch. "Mom, you shouldn't have to handle all this maintenance and business by yourself," he said. "We want to move in to help you manage the estate, and it will really help us save up for our own place in the city." I wanted to believe him. I really did. The house felt a little too big, a little too quiet without my husband, and the thought of having my family close by brought me a genuine sense of comfort. But it quickly became crystal clear that Sophie had an entirely different agenda. She wasted absolutely no time taking over my home. To her, my life's work wasn't a working vineyard or a family sanctuary. It was a free, multi-million-dollar backdrop for her social media lifestyle. Almost immediately, the peaceful weekends I cherished were replaced by a constant stream of her superficial influencer friends. Loud club music echoed through the valley, and empty champagne bottles littered my immaculate stone patios. Then, she started on the house itself, acting as if she held the deed. She called my classic, rustic Californian decor outdated and depressing. One afternoon, I walked out to the main tasting room and froze. The antique oak wine barrels, the ones my late husband had imported from France 30 years ago, were gone. In their place stood these hideous, cheap abstract metal statues that looked like tangled wire. I found Sophie lounging by the pool, taking selfies in the sun. "What happened to the barrels in the tasting room?" I asked calmly. "Oh, I had the groundskeeper drag those dusty old things into the back shed," she said, not even looking up from her screen. "They were completely ruining the modern aesthetic I am going for, Beatrice." My heart ached, but I kept my voice steady. My son, Oliver, seemed completely oblivious to what was happening under his own nose. Or maybe he was just too cowardly to get involved. Whenever I tried to bring up my concerns, he would just sit on the patio, glued to his laptop screen. "Mom, come on," he would sigh. "We are just trying to modernize the place a little bit. Don't make a big deal out of nothing." So I watched. I watched as my home was systematically hijacked. But the absolute worst part wasn't the statues or the noise. It was how Sophie treated me. She knew I had spent 30 years running high-end commercial kitchens. Instead of respecting my retirement, she decided I was her personal, unpaid caterer. Every Friday, without fail, she would casually stroll into my kitchen and start barking orders. "Beatrice, I have about 20 girls coming over for a sunset tasting later," she would say, inspecting her manicured nails. "Can you whip up a few of those artisanal charcuterie boards and maybe bake some fresh herb focaccia? Make sure it looks aesthetically pleasing for the cameras." She spoke to me as if I was a hired servant who had somehow forgotten my duties. I sat at my own kitchen island, quietly chopping vegetables, listening to the loud shrieks of laughter coming from my garden. I felt like an absolute stranger in the very home I built. I looked at the cheap metal statues through the window. I looked at the mountain of dirty glasses Sophie's friends had left on my counters. That was the exact moment I realized that giving them an inch meant they were going to take my entire life. I set my chef's knife down on the cutting board. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a deep breath, and made a decision. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and I was sitting at the long oak dining table, eating a simple plate of roasted vegetables. The house was momentarily peaceful, but I knew it was just the calm before the storm. Sophie casually breezed into the room, her eyes glued to her phone screen as usual, while Oliver trailed behind her with his laptop. She did not even acknowledge my presence before she dropped the bomb. "Oh, by the way, Beatrice," she said, her voice dripping with casual entitlement. "I told my best friend she could host her wedding here at the estate next month. I kept chewing my food, thinking I must have misheard her. It is going to be absolutely amazing for our social media exposure, she continued rapidly. There will be about 150 guests arriving, so I am going to need you to design a full 5-course menu for the reception. Make sure you include a vegan option for the appetizers, and I want a massive seafood tower for the cocktail hour. I stopped eating. I set my fork down slowly and stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer audacity of her words. You promised someone a free wedding venue and my free catering without even asking me, I said quietly, making sure to keep my voice perfectly level. Sophie finally looked up from her screen and rolled her eyes, heavily irritated that I wasn't immediately jumping for joy. We are family, Beatrice. You are retired anyway. It is not like you have anything better to do with your time. In toxic family dynamics, manipulators often suffer from what I call the entitlement illusion. It never starts with a massive demand. It begins with small boundary violations, a free meal here, an unpaid favor there, replacing a piece of furniture without asking. They slowly test the waters to see how much of your life they can claim as their own. They genuinely believe that your love for them is a free, all-access VIP pass to exploit your resources, your time, and your physical space. Because they share your blood, they think your life's work, your savings, and your sanctuary belong to them by default. When you constantly enable them, when you say yes just to keep the peace, they don't see your sacrifices as a generous gift. They see it as a mandatory obligation. And the moment you finally refuse to serve them, they act as if you are committing a terrible crime against them. To Sophie, my 30 years of high-end culinary expertise and my multi-million-dollar property were just free props for her to give away to boost her internet fame. I looked over at my son, waiting for him to step in, to defend his mother, or at least show a shred of common sense. Oliver finally looked up from his laptop, seeing the tension in the room. Mom, come on, he whined, looking at me like I was the one being unreasonable. We already promised them we would do it. Just do this one thing for us. It is really not that hard for you to cook for a crowd. I looked at the son I had raised with so much love and the woman who was slowly bleeding me dry. In the past, I might have argued. I might have yelled or cried or desperately tried to explain how incredibly disrespectful and financially draining this was going to be. But right then, sitting at my beautiful oak table, something inside me completely shifted. I realized that arguing with entitled people is a complete waste of breath. You cannot reason with someone who fundamentally disrespects you. Screaming matches only give them the drama they crave, and it makes you look like the unstable one. So, I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just looked at Sophie, and I gave her a very cold, very tight smile. Okay, I whispered calmly. I will handle it. Sophie smirked triumphantly, flipping her hair over her shoulder. She turned back to her phone, completely satisfied that she had put the old woman back in her place. Thank you, she muttered dismissively as she walked out of the room. She thought she had won. She thought I was just going to roll over, surrender my boundaries, and be the obedient little servant she so desperately wanted me to be. She had absolutely no idea what was coming. I stood up from the table, picked up my empty plate, and walked quietly back into my kitchen. I wasn't going to plan a 5-course menu for 150 strangers. I was going to plan my exit strategy, and it was going to be the most delicious thing I had ever prepared. The next morning, Sophie and Oliver woke up to a perfectly quiet house. It was a different kind of quiet than they were used to. There was no smell of fresh espresso drifting down the hallways. There was no sound of the groundskeepers trimming the vines or the housekeeping staff sweeping the stone patios. While they were upstairs sleeping peacefully, dreaming of their free internet fame, I had been very busy. There is a unique kind of power in realizing you do not have to participate in someone else's delusion. For months, they had relied on my silence, assuming my love for my son meant I would always surrender to their demands. They completely mistook my patience for weakness. Sophie walked downstairs in her silk robe, checking her phone, fully expecting to find a hot breakfast waiting for her. Instead, she found a crisp, white envelope sitting perfectly centered on the marble kitchen island. She opened it, and I watched from the shadows of the hallway as the color instantly drained from her face. It was a fully itemized commercial invoice. Estate venue rental fee for 1 weekend, $20,000. Premium catering fee for 150 guests, $15,000. Mandatory cleanup and security deposit, $10,000. At the bottom of the page, I had typed a very clear message. Payment is due in full before any event planning begins. Oliver stumbled into the kitchen a moment later, yawning and rubbing his eyes. "What is going on?" he demanded, seeing his wife staring in absolute shock at the piece of paper. But before Sophie could even explain, a much more horrifying realization hit her. The wine. She had promised her influencer friends an open bar featuring our exclusive, award-winning vintages. She dropped the invoice on the floor and sprinted toward the estate's crown jewel. The massive, temperature-controlled underground wine cellar, which held millions of dollars in rare inventory. Oliver ran right behind her, sensing the panic. Sophie grabbed the heavy iron handle of the cellar door and yanked it with all her might. It did not budge. She pulled again, harder this time, her manicured nails slipping on the metal. The old brass padlock that usually hung there was completely gone. In its place was a heavy-duty, state-of-the-art biometric digital security lock. I had paid a private security company a small fortune to come out and install it at midnight. A small yellow sticky note was attached to the glowing digital keypad. It simply read, "The free ride is over." Suddenly, they heard the sharp click of my heels echoing on the hardwood floor. I walked slowly into the grand foyer, holding my vintage leather weekender bag. I was dressed in a sharp linen suit, looking perfectly put together and calm. Sophie spun around, her face twisted in pure panic and rage. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, her voice echoing frantically through the high ceilings. "I have high-profile guests arriving in 3 weeks. You are going to completely ruin my reputation." I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or frustration. I simply looked at her with absolute, unwavering indifference. "I never promised you anything, Sophie," I stated firmly. "Your reputation is not my financial burden. If you want to host a luxury wedding at a luxury estate, you have to pay the luxury price." Oliver stepped in front of me, his face pale, finally realizing that I was not bluffing. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice shaking. "We do not have $45,000. We told them the venue and the wine were completely free. You cannot just lock it all away." I looked at my grown son, seeing the exact moment his sense of entitlement shattered. "I am not locking it away, Oliver," I replied smoothly. "I am simply protecting my business assets. Oh, and by the way, I have given my entire housekeeping and grounds crew the next 4 weeks off, fully paid. If you want this massive estate clean for your little party, you are going to have to scrub the floors yourselves." I handed Oliver a second, smaller envelope. "This is the contact information for a local party rental company and a very average catering service," I said calmly. "They can provide basic folding tables, cheap boxed wine, and a decent buffet, if you pay them entirely up front." Sophie looked like she was going to have a complete psychological breakdown right there in the grand foyer. "Where are you going?" she screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my vintage luggage. "You cannot just leave us with this massive mess." I adjusted the silk scarf around my neck and picked up my bag. "I am taking a month-long culinary tour through Tuscany," I replied smoothly. "My flight to Italy leaves in exactly 3 hours, and I really do not want to hit the morning traffic." Oliver stepped forward, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Mom, please," he begged, his eyes wide with genuine panic. "You know we cannot afford to hire an entire staff. The wedding is in 3 weeks, and there are 150 people coming. What are we supposed to do?" I looked at him, feeling a tiny twinge of sorrow, a mother's natural instinct to protect her child. But I intentionally pushed that feeling down. For way too long, I had been the soft safety net that caught them every single time they decided to jump without a parachute. "You are going to figure it out, Oliver," I said gently but with unbreakable firmness. "You are both in your 30s. You wanted to act like the owners of this estate, so now you get to handle the responsibilities of the owners. Welcome to the real world of responsible adults." I walked right past them, the sound of my heels steady and deliberate on the hardwood floor. I opened the heavy front oak doors, letting the crisp, beautiful morning air flood into the stuffy house. A sleek black town car was already waiting for me at the bottom of the long gravel driveway. Sophie followed me out onto the porch, her face flushed with pure, unadulterated rage. "If you get in that car, I am never speaking to you again," she yelled, her voice echoing wildly across the quiet vineyard. "You are the most selfish, horrible mother I have ever met." I didn't turn around. I didn't try to justify my actions, I didn't argue back, and I certainly didn't apologize. I just handed my bag to the driver, who opened the door for me with a polite, knowing nod. As I slid into the comfortable leather seat, I rolled down the tinted window just an inch. "Enjoy your stay," I called out evenly. "And please, do not forget to take out the trash on Tuesdays." The car slowly pulled away from the estate, the gravel crunching so satisfyingly beneath the tires. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the two of them standing completely frozen on the grand porch, looking utterly lost and terrified. It was a harsh lesson, maybe even a little brutal to witness. But it was the absolute only way they were ever going to learn that actions have severe consequences. Almost immediately, my cell phone started vibrating aggressively in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was exploding with rapid-fire text messages and missed calls. Oliver was begging me to turn the car around, promising they would cancel the wedding. Sophie was sending massive, frantic paragraphs, threatening to ruin my business on social media, calling me every vicious name in the book. In the past, seeing those hateful messages would have sent me into a deep spiral of guilt and anxiety. I would have rushed back, apologized for upsetting them, and spent the next 3 weeks cooking myself into a state of physical exhaustion just to keep the peace. But not today. I looked at the phone for one long, quiet moment, completely detached from the manufactured drama flashing on the screen. Then, with a deep, liberating exhale, I pressed the power button and turned the device completely off. I tossed it back into my purse and leaned my head against the cool glass of the window. The lush green hills of Napa Valley rolled by in a beautiful, peaceful blur. For the first time in over 6 months, I was not thinking about grocery lists or ungrateful guests or the crushing weight of someone else's toxic expectations. I was thinking about fresh handmade pasta, aged Barolo wine, and the warm, golden Italian sun. The heavy burden I had been carrying for them was finally gone. And as the car merged onto the highway, taking me toward the airport and toward my absolute freedom, the air inside the cabin felt incredibly light. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, I genuinely smiled. I spent an absolutely glorious month in Tuscany. I drank beautiful aged Barolo, learned to make authentic pasta entirely from scratch, and did not check my phone a single time. When I finally returned to Napa, the heavy iron gates of my estate opened to a profoundly different atmosphere. The house was perfectly quiet. There was no thumping club music, no empty champagne bottles on the lawn, and no cheap abstract statues in sight. I walked into the kitchen and found 2 sets of house keys resting quietly on the pristine marble island. A few days later, I heard from a mutual friend about exactly what had happened while I was gone. Without my free catering, without my staff, and without access to a single drop of my premium wine, Sophie was forced to completely cancel her friend's luxury wedding. She had to call over 150 people to explain the situation, publicly humiliating herself in front of her entire social media circle. And because they couldn't afford to pay a professional cleaning crew, Oliver and Sophie spent 3 agonizing days scrubbing the entire estate from top to bottom before they packed their bags and moved out in absolute defeat. Society often pushes a very specific, very toxic narrative about motherhood. We are constantly told that mothers must sacrifice absolutely everything for their children, forever. We are conditioned to believe that tough love is somehow selfish, or that prioritizing our own peace over our children's convenience is deeply cruel. But there is a harsh truth that nobody really wants to talk about. When you continuously act as a financial and emotional safety net for lazy, entitled adults, you are stripping away their only real chance to grow up. You cannot cultivate responsible, independent human beings if you constantly serve as a soft cushion for their bad decisions and their extreme arrogance. Locking that wine cellar and pushing my son out of the nest so abruptly felt like the most ruthless thing I have ever done. But deep down, I knew it was the absolute most profound act of love I could offer him. A brutal wake-up call and a cold dose of reality is infinitely more valuable than a lifetime of unpaid servitude. Now, as I sit back on my terrace, watching the golden sun slowly set over the rolling green vines, I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. My late husband's antique oak barrels are safely back in the tasting room, exactly where they belong. I reclaimed my home, my pride, and most importantly, my absolute peace of mind. And the best part is knowing that I did it all without stooping to their level. I did not need to scream or argue or desperately beg for basic respect. I simply drew an unshakable line in the sand and walked away. So, if you ever find yourself trapped in a situation where someone is treating you like a doormat in your own kingdom, I want you to remember something very important. Your boundaries are valid, and you have every right to live your life on your own terms. You are the one who holds the keys. Do not be afraid to lock the door, pack your bags, take a long vacation, and let them clean up their own mess.